Hello biology students, and welcome to this video where we're going to talk about our second macromolecule, which is lipids. So at this point, we've already talked all about carbohydrates, so now we're going to look at our second type of macromolecule, which is lipids. Now, lipids is a pretty big category of macromolecules. It includes many different types of different molecules. However, lipids all have one thing in common, is that all lipids are generally nonpolar. And we know if things are nonpolar, that means they don't mix well with water, right? Remember from last unit, water is polar, and therefore nonpolar things don't mix in. So therefore, a new vocab word for you here is the word hydrophobic. And hydrophobic, literally, if you look at the roots, hydro means water, phobic means fear. So this word literally means having a fear of water. So if we say lipids are hydrophobic, we mean they don't mix well with water. So some other basic facts about lipids. Just like carbohydrates, they are also made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, lipids have fewer oxygen atoms than carbs. So if you think of an example of a carbohydrate, we knew monosaccharides, for example, had the formula C6H12O6. So you can see the carbon to oxygen ratio is about 1:1. Lipids would have significantly fewer oxygen molecules than a carbohydrate. So maybe a lipid might be something like C6H12O, right? Only one oxygen molecule. There are four main categories of lipids that you have to know. You have to know triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes. And lipids also have many functions. They, just like polysaccharides, they act as a long-term energy storage molecule. But lipids can actually hold twice as much energy as a polysaccharide can. They help to insulate the body. You can think of fat helps to keep you warm. They help to protect the body. In fact, many of your important organs in the body are surrounded by fat because it acts as protection. And then lipids are also the main component of the cell membrane. They act as signals in the body, so some cells will send out lipids to signal other cells to do things in the body, and they also have a waterproofing function. So let's talk about the four types of lipids. So the first type is triglycerides, and triglycerides are fats, right? So whenever you hear of saturated fat, unsaturated fat, fat found in food, oils, these are all triglycerides, okay? So a triglyceride is an example of a polymer, right? And the polymer, the triglyceride, is made up of four different monomers that come together. It's made up of a glycerol monomer and 3 fatty acid monomers. Okay, so we'll look at that structure a little bit more in a second. Specifically, the functions of triglycerides are long-term energy, right? And that makes sense because when you eat fat in food, that is the energy that the thing you ate stored up. So if I ate a steak, the cow that I'm eating had fat in it because that cow was storing long-term energy. So the fat I'm eating in that steak was actually the cow storing that energy. Triglycerides also act as insulation. They help to keep you warm and protection. So before we go on to the next slide, let's look a little more at the structure of a triglyceride. Or more specifically, I want to look at the structure of the monomers. So we said here that triglycerides have two different monomers. They have one glycerol monomer and then 3 fatty acid monomers. So if you look over here, I want you to note the structure of glycerol. So glycerol is 3 carbon, a carbon skeleton that has 3 carbons with 3 hydroxyl groups on it. And then the structure of a fatty acid is a long carbon skeleton with lots of carbons and hydrogens with a carboxyl group at the end, okay? So here's a picture of a triglyceride. So you can see here are my 4 monomers that make up the triglyceride. You can see here's my 1 glycerol monomer, and this, via dehydration synthesis, is going to be bonded to my 3 fatty acid monomers, okay? So fatty acids and glycerol are the monomers that make up triglycerides, and triglyceride is the polymer. Because I have to join each of my 3 fatty acids to the glycerol molecule, I have to do dehydration synthesis 3 times. So I have to remove 3 waters to bond my 3 fatty acids to my glycerol backbone. So let's talk about the different types of triglycerides. So the first type of triglyceride is called a saturated triglyceride. So this is what you see as saturated fat on a nutritional label. And then what makes something a fat saturated is that if you look in the fatty acid, so this portion of the molecule right here, every carbon-to-carbon bond is a single bond. So you can see this bond is a single bond, this bond is a single bond, all the way down the line. Each carbon-to-carbon bond is a single bond. Now it turns out single bonds allow the molecule to, at the molecular level, line up in a straight line. So if you look at each of these fatty acids, they are straight. Now things that are straight, you can kind of imagine if things are straight, they can pack really closely together. And if things pack closely together, that's going to make them solid at room temperature, right? Solid, on the molecular level, solid things have the molecules closely together. So that's actually why saturated fats are solid at room temperature, is because there are single bonds in the carbons of the fatty acids. This allows them to be straight, which allows them to pack tightly, which makes them solid. Saturated fats are found in animal fats, so you can think like the fat found in dairy, the fat found in red meat. Those are all saturated fat. The second type of triglyceride is an unsaturated triglyceride. And this is a type of triglyceride that in one of the fatty acids, there are at least one double bond. So if you see right here, can you see how this carbon-carbon bond is actually a double bond? And I want you to notice where that double bond is. It introduces a kink or a bend in the fatty acid. So you can imagine if there are kinks or bends in the fatty acids, the molecules cannot pack as tightly together, and this prevents them from becoming solid at room temperature. So unsaturated fats are actually liquid at room temperature. So I want you to think about oils, like the oil found in fish, plant oils, so like olive oil, canola oil, sunflower oil. Those are all unsaturated fat. You also might have heard the terms monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat. That's referring to the number of double bonds that are found in the fatty acids. So if you have one double bond in your triglyceride, that would be a monounsaturated fat. If you have more than one double bond in your triglyceride, as you see here, that would be a polyunsaturated fat if you have two or more. So when you eat a triglyceride, what's going to happen in your body is you're going to break down that triglyceride into its monomers. You're going to break it down into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. You're going to use those monomers to make energy via the process of cellular respiration. And then any extra that you do not need for energy is going to be stored as adipose cells. And adipose cells is the fancy science word for fat cells. So it's stored as fat in your body so you can use that energy later when you need it. Okay, so that was the first type of lipid. That's probably the most complicated one to understand. The second type of lipid is a phospholipid. And if you look at this picture here of the phospholipid, it actually looks pretty similar to a triglyceride. So let's look at the similarities first. So both phospholipids and triglycerides each are made up of 4 monomers. Just like a triglyceride, one of the monomers of a phospholipid is the glycerol molecule, which is right here in purple. Whereas a triglyceride had 3 fatty acids that act as monomers for it, phospholipids only have 2 fatty acids. So you can see there's one fatty acid right here, and then there's one right here. Remember, if we were looking at a triglyceride, there would have been a 3rd fatty acid that doesn't exist in this molecule. Now, what makes a phospholipid different from a triglyceride is its 4th monomer, instead of being another fatty acid, is a phosphate group. So up here is a phosphate group that also is part of the phospholipid molecule. Now, usually when we're drawing a phospholipid, we don't draw this complicated picture. Usually we draw this more simplistic picture here. And this picture is helpful for many reasons. So it has 2 parts to it here. So there's the head region, and this is representing the phosphate group and the glycerol molecule. And then there's these 2 little tails that represent the 2 fatty acids. So it turns out phospholipids are pretty unique because just like all other lipids, the 2 tails are nonpolar. So this part of the phospholipid is hydrophobic. It does not like water. However, phosphate groups are polar molecules. So it turns out that the head region of the phospholipid is polar, or it's hydrophilic, meaning it loves water. So we kind of have this weird situation where one side of the molecule does not like water and the other side does. Now, like I said before, triglycerides, their monomers were 1 glycerol and 3 fatty acids. Phospholipids are made up of 1 glycerol and 2 fatty acids, and then 1 phosphate group. So the claim to fame for phospholipids is that they are the major component of the cell membrane. Now, if you look at this picture right over here, this is actually a picture of the cell membrane. And then you can see the cell membrane is actually a bilayer, and by bilayer, bi usually means 2, and layer is a layer. So the cell membrane is actually made up of 2 layers of phospholipids. And I want you to notice here the structure of the cell membrane. I want you to notice that, imagine that this part is inside the cell, and then this part is outside the cell. And both in and out of your cell are water. Now, because the heads of the phospholipids are hydrophilic, water-loving, they're polar, they want to point towards the water and associate with it. However, the tails are nonpolar or hydrophobic, so they do not want to mix with water. So when the membrane forms, the 2 layers of phospholipids actually orient themselves so the tails are pointing inside, so they can be away from the water, and the heads are pointing outside, so they can be near the water. It's kind of cool. Okay. So the third type of lipid is a steroid. Okay, and the structure of a steroid is basically a carbon skeleton that's made up of 4 fused rings. Now, steroids are a little different because we don't really consider them to be a polymer because they're not actually made up of monomers, and you'll be able to see that more when I show you a picture in a second. The main functioning of steroids is to act as signaling molecules. So kind of one of the most famous steroids are all the hormones, so things like testosterone and estrogen, all the hormones of the body. And these molecules like testosterone and estrogen act as signals. They signal other parts of your body to do certain things. So another really important steroid that you have to know is cholesterol. So you've seen that word before on different food labels, on different nutrition labels. And it turns out cholesterol is a really important component of the cell membrane. So the reason that we need to eat cholesterol because it helps to make up our cell membrane along with phospholipids. And all types of steroids, cholesterol, hormones, they are all essential for cells to function properly. So here's a picture of some steroids. So here you can see what I was talking about with the basic structure. So the basic structure is that we have 4 carbon rings that are all fused together. And then they have different functional groups stuck onto them. So here's a hydroxyl group, here's what's called a methyl group. And depending on which functional groups are stuck on, that gives the different steroids their different properties. Now these aren't considered a polymer because you can't really break these steroids down into smaller pieces, so there aren't really monomers per se, okay? So steroids are kind of an exception to our monomer-polymer rule. So now you also might have heard of steroids in a different context. You also might have heard of steroids as illegal ways to build up your muscle. And the steroids that we're talking about when you hear that are actually what's called an anabolic steroid. And these are basically it's just actually synthetic testosterone. It's testosterone that's been made in the lab. And if you take these illegal steroids, basically what it does is, like all steroids, testosterone acts as a signaling molecule, and it will signal your molecule to increase the rate at which we make proteins, which will help you basically build up your muscles. Anabolic steroids can also act as a medicinal drug to treat different diseases. So they do have some useful uses, like treating things like HIV and cancer, but more often than not, you hear of them because they're being misused in professional sports. So finally, the last type of lipid that you have to know are waxes. This is the one we're going to talk about the least, though it is still pretty interesting. And basically what you have to know is its main functions. And the functions of waxes are to either act as a protective coating on something, or it also acts as waterproofing. So plants use waxes often to help retain, plants are often covered in waxes on the outside of leaves to help keep water inside the leaf because they act as a waterproofing layer. But we have waxes in our body too. So I want you to think about earwax. Earwax lines the inside of your ear canal to help protect from insects that try to enter your ear canal. Okay, so it's acting as a protective function. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.